you for having me on SideQuest. Yeah, my name is Peter Field. I've been a game designer in the industry for just over 10 years. I've worked at places like Ninja Theory and Naughty Dog, and I've settled at Media Molecule. And we've spent the last 6 years crafting this game, Dreams. So today I'm going to talk through a level that I've blocked out in Dreams, and I'll just talk about some of the techniques and the tips that I use when I'm building levels. I think they'll be hugely applicable to designers, especially level designers, but I think that there's a lot of crossover between level design and environment art, so I think that'll be very interesting to environment artists, budding environment artists as well. So let me know what you think of it. Let me, if it's the kind of thing that you like, then I can try and do more of this kind of thing, but we'll just jump straight in. So, so this is what we would call a level blockout. And that is a very, very simplified version of a level. So we use just generally like the most simple shapes possible to communicate the space so that it is playable. But we've spent as little effort as possible sort of making it. So you can think of it like a sketch if you were an artist, or a storyboard if you were a filmmaker. It's communicating your ideas rather than polishing it up to a nice level. So you can see that these aren't filing cabinets, they're just representative of filing cabinets, and that gets the message across. So that's enough. And these windows are just holes in a wall, there's no glass here. It doesn't matter because as soon as you see it, you think window, and then you can carry on. So the reason that we would block a level out in this way is because it's the quickest way to get to a point where everyone can sit down and play it and understand what the level wants to be or aspires to be, and then you can make changes very quickly and iterate on it very quickly in this stage because it's so low fidelity. So the first thing that I always do when I start a level is I stick down a place where the player will start, and I stick down a place where the player is going to try and get to. A level is not necessarily always going to be traversing from A to B, but a lot of the time it is. So this is how I start levels where you have to get somewhere. And what this does is it sort of annihilates any blank canvas syndrome of like, I'm not sure how big this level has to be, I don't know how much space I've got to play with. As soon as you've got a start and an end point, all you're doing is filling in the gap in between, which becomes a much more easy proposition. So I've set down, this is where I'm starting, and I'm going to head towards the lighthouse. And the thing that is quite good about this as well is I also use it as a way of communicating to the player where they have to go, so they've got a clear objective in their mind. So they're not aimlessly wandering around like bumping against the sides and the boundaries of the level and sort of like getting frustrated. They have a clear objective, and what we're going to do is we're going to reiterate this objective many times throughout the level so that it keeps reminding the player why they are trying to get to this place, where they're trying to get to rather. So I'm going to look around and I'm going to go through this door because it's the only place that I can go right now. So I'll open the door. So this room is just a simple factory space, but there's a lot of things that are blocking my line of sight. And the tip that I wanted to communicate here is designing for mystery. So I can't remember which button it is. Okay, I've got the right button. So this is another example of how I could have laid this level out. It's just an empty space. And as soon as you enter it from your point of entry, you can immediately see everything that the space has to offer. It's not hiding any secrets. You can see your exit over here, and that's it. So there's no reason to move around and explore. It's not very exciting. So what I've done is I've covered up all of the exits by just adding a load of geometry into the level. So I've put a big block in the middle of the level here. Oops, sorry, wrong button. Put a big block in the middle of the level here, and then that I decided was going to be a big bit of machinery, and I started putting pipes in there and gantries and walkways and steps, and then it became a factory. So it wasn't a factory until I started blocking out the space. But now, because I can't see where I can, how to exit the level, I'm going to start moving around the space to try and explore it, to find my way around. So if you want to motivate movement in the player, you have to hide things from the player so that they have to move around to find them. So now I'm over on this balcony here, and I can see the exit. And that's quite nice. It's been hidden from me, and I've had to move around and discover it. So designing for mystery is basically hiding things that the player knows should be there, but they aren't visible to the player immediately, so they have to seek them out. So this next section is a corridor, it's a bridge actually over like a lower area, and this could very well, I don't really want the player to go anywhere here, so this could very well have just been a straight corridor with walls on either side, which looks very uninteresting, but functionally is kind of the same kind of thing. So if I go along here, because this is a sheer drop, I actually can't go that way because I would fall to my death. So even though it's like a cutaway wall, it's still blocking the player, but it's much more visually interesting. And as you can see, it's like another opportunity for us to re-establish our goal, so that it like is framed nicely in the hole in the wall. So I'm going to carry on playing. I'm actually going to see if anyone would like to play the next section. This could go terribly wrong, but we'll see. This is just an experiment. So just carry on playing. This isn't a trick or anything. So we can see the door at the end of this. When you approach the door, there should be a button. You can see what happens. So this door's locked. That's a bit frustrating. That's a bit annoying. There's another door. Two locked doors in a row. That's really frustrating. This is probably verging on like throw your controller out of the window sort of points. So what we want to do is, I think it's okay to frustrate the player a little bit, because that sort of creates some tension that means that when the player finally realizes where they have to go, they get like a nicer release. So I'm going to let Oliver stew for a little bit, and then if it's too complicated, we'll help him out. And that's my fault, by the way, if this is difficult. Okay. But you found it, but you did also fall to your death. So, so what we found there, I'll just quickly run through the level again, was the obvious way to go, and the way that I was signposting when you initially came across the bridge, was to these doors that you can see. There's some like boxes obscuring the doors here, and these are both blocked, and that's quite frustrating. But then when you turn around and you see the bridge from a new perspective, did you manage to spot the pipes underneath the bridge?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that I'm trying to do here to sort of make this much more visible on the return journey, and I've made the player return to this space and enter it from a new perspective by sort of teasing them to the end of the corridor where the doors are, and then making those blocked exits so the player can't go that way. So there's like lots of leading lines leading this way. There's like crates on the floor, which means that the greatest walkable floor space is sort of leading in this direction as well. And just the fact that the pipes are visible from this perspective and they aren't from the other perspective makes it like a nice reveal. So hopefully that sort of felt a little bit, you were like a little bit frustrated. You were like, what is this guy talking about? Why is he like giving me lots of blocked doors? That's bad game design, right? And then you came back across the bridge and you were like, aha, a little moment of realization as you spotted the pipes. Okay, so I'm going to drop down onto the pipes now. And this is what we call a one-way valve. So I can drop down here, but I can't jump back up. And the reason that we might do that is to sort of just help the player from, prevent the player from getting too lost, because it compartmentalizes the space into smaller, more manageable, bite-sized chunks. And the reason I'm doing it here is because this next space I'm going to drop into is quite large, and the player has the potential of... Is everyone okay? Everyone's fine, don't worry. I'll talk about loud noises distracting the player and attracting their attention in a moment, actually. I don't think I will, actually. I'm just lying. You can cut this all up, right, and just make me sound cooler. Okay. So this space is much larger, and it's much more open. So the player has the potential of getting a bit lost here. And if they couldn't find their way through this area, they might go back and explore the previous area. So if we use one-way valves, then it just makes this space, it forces them forward in a gentle way, it like nudges them forward into the space. And the other thing that's quite good about a one-way, about how we're entering this space is we're entering it from like a high up vantage point, so we can get a nice overview of the space and we can sort of plan our route. So for example, if this was like a combat space, or if you were trying to avoid guards in here, if you entered from ground level, you'd have to mentally map out the level whilst also like engaging in this stressful, tense gameplay, which is not ideal, and people aren't very good at mentally mapping spaces when they're under the duress of combat and things like that. So this allows players to take stock of the space, make a little mental map, make a little, like formulate a little plan, and then dive into it when they're ready. So they are the people that sort of push them into the gameplay. And as I enter this space, there are lots of options. I could go over here into this warehouse. I could go through this tunnel here. There's another tunnel that I spotted from up on the rooftop over here, and each of them seem like they're like heading in completely different directions. So how do we stop the player from getting lost in a space like this? Well, the things that I've done is I've got 3 very disparate routes, but they all actually converge on a singular point, and that's called like a funnel or a choke point, and that's where we take back control and we know exactly what the player is going to be able to experience. So although it feels like a wide open space, it's actually just a small bubble of freedom, and then they all converge later. And they all have subtle little things to sort of help signpost where to go and breadcrumb the player to where I want them to go. So when I enter this space, we have like a lighter area up here, which is illuminating the movement of this fan. That might also be buzzing. So when we were talking about loud noises attracting the player, you could have like some noise up in this area as well. And the player would think, I want to get up into this office space above this warehouse. How would I do that? I might track along these gantries and notice that I can climb up onto this lorry. And now I'm on the gantries and I can make my way across to the office. So that's one possibility. I'm not going to take it because I want to talk about the others as well. And then if I went over to this tunnel over here, you can notice again there's like big leading lines pointing towards this space. I might have some signage on the floor as well, like white lines curving around into the tunnel. If I go up to the most obvious exit, again it's a dead end. That's a dark tunnel that's locked off. But here we could talk about things that players recognize instinctively because they're everyday shapes and geometry that you know have, I think they're called affordances. So this is a door frame, and that's a portal to a new space. We use doors every day, and doors are forward moving through. And we've got steps that are curving round in a curved formation. And steps also lead somewhere, so we instinctively see these shapes and we like, I think I could go through there and that will lead somewhere. And the fact that they're curving round as well means that we can't see where they lead just yet, which again is using that designing for mystery sort of element to intrigue the player and sort of pique their curiosity. So as I come up into this space, I'll just quickly go this way to show how the spaces connect up together. This is the office that is above the warehouse. And this hallway is where all of the paths converge. And this door here is the convergence point, the choke point that I'm going to sort of, all of the paths are going to join back together here. And this is using a lot of the elements that I spoke about before. So there's light shining from behind the door, which is illuminating the door. It's important to note that light doesn't actually attract players in the same way that like a light attracts a moth. But they're very good for highlighting geometric details, and so it can be a sort of look at me sort of indicator rather than actually drawing the player towards the light. But the door is moving in the wind, and so is the blinds, and the door is only slightly ajar, which means you know it can be opened, but you can't see what's behind it, so designing for mystery again. And then as I make my way up this slightly confined stairwell, I see this point over here. So I can unblock this door. And what was a frustrating moment before, which was this door that blocked me and Oliver, is now actually just a shortcut back to the earlier part of the level. So this is a personal preference, but I feel like if you have a space and you are going to use things like one-way valves to truncate your level and push the player forward, it feels a little bit frustrating to me that I can't go back and explore every element of the level and every area in the level. So when I used the one-way valve, this whole area at the end of this corridor was inaccessible. But I've mitigated that by having this initially frustrating door become a shortcut back to the earlier area. So we're sort of having our cake and eating it now. We're using one-way valves to push the player forwards and then using a shortcut back to the earlier part so that we can always access all of the level. And this is just a personal preference. It makes the space feel more believable to me. And and more like a real world, like livable space, as opposed to like a linear sequence of events that can be typical of video games. The next point that I want to talk about is contrasting spaces. So this corridor, this stairwell is interior. It's quite dark, it's claustrophobic, these are narrow stairs. And that contrasts heavily with coming out onto this rooftop, which is a bright, colourful, open area. And it feels brighter and more colourful and more open because the space that preceded it was dark and claustrophobic. So they contrast heavily, and that makes it feel more impactful. So if, for example, if I'd entered this space from another rooftop, it wouldn't feel like a moment, it wouldn't feel impactful. And it's also another moment for us to highlight our goal again. So after sort of getting a little bit lost in that courtyard area, we've re-established our goal, we're back on track, and we can start making our way to the lighthouse again. There's a couple of elements over here. So I want to head towards this lighthouse, but I can't make my way over this area here. This is like a big ravine. But I might recognize these pipes from before because we used pipes as a bridge before. So maybe I can use this to get over to this area here and make my way up this hillside. So that is, that's just emblematic of how everything that you place in a level is a conversation that you have with your player. So this is a dialogue that I've started by saying, you used pipes before, and now every time you see pipes, you're going to think that you can use them as a bridge again. So I'm using that as like, that's now part of the vocabulary between me and the player, and we can use that to sort of highlight routes that the player could take. So here we've got a jump over this gap, which is not a thing I've asked the player to do up to this point. So they might be a bit hesitant to sort of even think that's possible. They're not sure how far the player can jump. So I'm going to have to encourage them quite heavily to do so. And I do that by adding this, what I call a diving board here, which is any bit of geometry that's protruding from an edge and makes the jump look slightly easier. And also in the same way as the pipes, like everything that I put in a level is put there for a reason. So a player might see that and think, oh, they wouldn't have put that there unless I could jump across this gap. They might jump across the gap. But if they do fall, another point that I want to raise is you don't have to kill the player to say that you've failed, because killing the player and having them restart from a checkpoint is fundamentally going to break the immersion and remind them that they're playing a game. I'm not pretending that when we make levels super immersive, people forget they're playing a game, but the longer that we can stay in the play state, in the gameplay state, the better. So all I've done here, I've not mitigated the challenge at all, I've not undermined the challenge, but I've got a lower level and some that catches the player, we could call it a safety net, and then some steps that lead back up to where the challenge was established. So they failed it, they know they failed it, but they are given a second chance to proceed. Imagine if I fell down it again, that would have been bad. I'm trying to remember what the next part is. Luckily, yeah, so this is a continuation of keeping a dialogue going with the player, but every time we put something in level, like, we should be conscious to communicate what we are intending as clearly as possible to a player. I mean, that's not necessarily true. You might want to obfuscate things to frustrate the player like I did earlier, but on the whole, generally, I want to really communicate what's going on. So I want to get to these pipes. I can't because this spiky fence is in the way. And that is functionally blocking me, but also it's geometry screams, you're not meant to be here. You're like, this is something that in the real world would be used to stop trespassers. So as an example of an alternative, which I think is badly communicating to the player, we could also have just removed the geometry so that it becomes a large jump that the player can't make it across. And the reason this is bad communication with the player is because, especially in this example, to be honest, is we've just taught the player to jump across gaps here. So they might look at this challenge and be like, oh, okay, an escalation of challenge, I'm going to have to jump further this time. And they might try and jump across and fall down below, and then they're frustrated because they have to make the way all the way back up again. So both of them functionally do the same thing, but one is communicating very clearly to the player that they can't proceed that way, and one of them is communicating very badly to the player. So just being very clear about communication can reduce a lot of frustration in the player and make a space, a level flow more easily. And this goes for lots of things like, I've put a lot of doors in this area. We're going to talk about doors. I get heavily into doors, it's quite weird. And this is an example of how I would communicate that you can't interact with that door. Because, for example, when you first came across those doors and you tried them, that's because the language was saying, this is a door that could be moved through. And you went up to it and you pressed square and it said, the door's locked. And that's quite frustrating, right? That felt a bit bad. So if you can communicate to a player that the door is not actionable from like a distance, then that's better because they won't actually go up to it and try it and be frustrated. So that's one example of how you could communicate that a door is not usable. Another example down these stairs is, I've just piled up a bunch of furniture. You can barely see the door. Can't even get close to it. And a much better example, but I did put these in so that I could talk about how you could mitigate this problem, is just remove the doors. Because no one really cares if a space is, it's much better to have a space that's less frustrating than realistic, right? So like, you might, if you went down these stairs and there was no door down there, that would feel very weird, but it's actually better than having a door that's locked that the player can't interact with. And just to try and redeem myself earlier from that horrible moment that I made you sit through earlier, Oliver, is this is actually the second shortcut back into the space. So previously these were two locked doors that were frustrating, and now they're two shortcuts back to the earlier area, which makes the space feel smaller and more accessible. So I hope that's okay. Okay, so the next point is just talking about adding furniture, temp furniture to your space, because a space can feel very different when it's completely empty compared to when it is full of furniture. So if I came into this space, functionally as a designer, all I'm really required to do is this, okay? It's like map out the boundaries of the level, and an artist will probably enjoy fleshing that out with like furniture and things like that. But the problem is that's not representative of the scale of space that the player will have to use for gameplay. So if I enter this space, it feels really large, and say this was like a small puzzle space, I would feel like this is too large, so I'd make it smaller, and then an artist would come along and put furniture in it, and all of a sudden it feels completely different because the walkable floor space is much smaller. There's lots of things that are blocking my view, and you might sort of end up making a space way too small. So a technique that I like to use to make sure that I've got enough space for both my gameplay and the artist's props is just fleshing it out with just some really simple geometry that I will communicate with the artist and say, you can move this any way you like, but I'm just using it to make sure that I've got enough space for the gameplay that I intend to happen here, and also your art. Okay, so that's that space. These are just 1 meter blocks that I just plaster all over the walls. It seems to work. That's like something that I did a lot in The Last of Us and things like that, where like the scale of the space really mattered because you couldn't move very fast. Okay, so we finally made it to the pipe bridge, and then we're going to move over into this space. So this is going to be a lot of talking about puzzle setup. So as I approach this gate, I can see the lighthouse again, and I'm going to try and open the gate. And it's locked by this padlock, and in jostling the gate, I've actually knocked over this crate. I'm trying to think of the best way to communicate this. So I need to find a key to get through the gate, and I might look in this guard tower, but this truck is very inconveniently parked in a really bad way, which means I can't get to the door to enter the guard tower. So I might try and find another way up to the guard tower to look for a key. And I'm going to climb up this, the crate that got knocked over, and I can make it up into the guard tower, and I can start exploring the guard tower for this key. So, okay, no key. It's really strange pretending you don't know where the solution to the puzzle is when I put it there. Okay. No. This is locked from the other side by a very terribly parked truck. Ah, there's the key. The key seems to have not been attached to... Oh dear. time to edit my level and make it playable. There we go. Oh no, wait, there's some logic that is going to require the door. Oh no, that should be okay. I have no clue why this isn't working, but we can find out. And now you get to see some nice dreams logic. I got the key. Apologies for that. So the reason that this is important is because I'll try and play through the level in a slightly different way in a second, and you can see how if I hadn't been very careful about the ordering of those events, it can be very confusing to players and it can miscommunicate exactly what you intend to happen. So I've unlocked this gate. So for argument's sake, imagine if I didn't have to, so if I press this button, we get a completely different scenario. You enter the area, there's no truck blocking the door, and there's no, and so I could go up to the gate and find out the gate's locked, or I could first of all go straight over here and enter the guard tower just because I might want to explore. And I might accidentally come across the keys and find the keys. And then when I go over to the gate, it's locked, but I've already got the key. So it feels like a little bit arbitrary. Why did I have to pick up the key to go to the gate when it felt like the gate was already open, because by the time I got there, I already had the key. So problem solution ordering is a technique to make sure that you realize there's a problem before you can access the solution. So in our case, the problem was finding a key for the gate, and the solution wasn't accessible until I had realized that by interacting with the gate, because the act of interacting with the gate knocked over the crate, which allowed me to go and find the key. There's examples of levels that I've made in The Last of Us as well. There's a puzzle at the end of the giraffe level, where that's another example of problem solution ordering that I think communicates it quite nicely. So I'm fully aware that's quite a hard thing to communicate, and I think I need to work on communicating that, but I hope that made sense. Okay, so I'm gonna make my way up to the lighthouse. And compared to the last area where it was quite a small, confined little puzzle space, and I was spending a little bit of time in there, this next area is supposed to feel much more liberating. Like I'm going to cover a large amount of ground quite quickly now, and that's just contrasting heavily with the slower pace of the puzzle area. So it's the same things that I was talking about before, just applied to pacing as opposed to geometry. So before, when we contrasted light and dark and scale of space, now we're contrasting the speed of the player, and they all work. They all make the player feel, they all come across as more impactful to the player. Okay, so the door's locked from the other side, so I'm going to find my way around. So now I'm going to talk about denial and reward. So I thought I was really close to the lighthouse, and I thought I just had to walk up this hill. But the door is locked, and I'm going to have to find another way around, and it's going to force me into these dark woods. So now I'm losing sight of the thing that was very close to me, and this is just a really nice technique to keep a longer level feel engaging throughout the whole playthrough. So if you imagine, if I could always see the lighthouse the whole time I was meandering through the level, I would always be able to know how close I was, and I wouldn't feel any tension or in sort of as I was exploring. But if you obscure the player's objective, then they feel a little bit more tension, because they're like, I want to get back to that thing that I thought I had, and that creates tension, and then when they finally see it, it's like a nice release. So that sort of ebb and flow of getting lost and getting found is much more interesting than constantly knowing where you are. So I'm a bit lost in the woods over here, so I've seen this little area. This is another example of light illuminating a space to draw the player's attention to it, and it's also a slightly different kind of thing than the rest of the woods. The rest of the woods are these tall trees, and then this little man-made structure is going to draw my attention to it. And as I walk into the space, I've got like a nicely framed view of the lighthouse again, so that's what I talk about when I talk about getting lost and getting found. If this was a real level, I'd make the woods much larger and get the player really lost, but to cram all of these tips and techniques into this talk as fast as I want to, I'm going to pretend that we were lost in those woods for about 20 minutes. And that was really creepy. Wasn't that a really creepy experience back there? So this is just something, this is again like I don't consider this a tip or a technique, but this is something that I like to do, and it's just taking stock of where you've come from to sort of, I don't know, just communicate to the player how far they've come. So I've put this rock here so that when I climb up onto it, I've got a nice view of the entire journey. And you can see over here, this is the room where we first started out. We can see the rooftops, and we can see the warehouse, and we can see the puzzle area over here. So it's a nice way for the player to understand how far they've come, and it also means that we get a nice view of this. So again, we've opened up a shortcut back to the previous area, which means we don't have to go through the woods again, which isn't a big deal in this example, but if it was a 20-minute section, then that might make all the difference. And I think we're up to one of the final points. And so if you think back to when I started the talk and I said the first thing that I do is I place a starting point and an ending point for the player. And in this example, the ending point was the lighthouse. The very next thing I do is I place down a bunch of completely random, uneven terrain for the player for me to build my level upon. Because if I start building a level before I have terrain to build it on, I'm probably going to build everything quite flat, and because that's how editors work, that's how building geometry and spaces works. I'm going to build it quite flat. There's absolutely no reason for me not to build everything on the same level. There's absolutely no reason for me to not make it in a completely linear way. But that doesn't happen in real life. If you look at cities and you look at everything that is built in the areas where you live or where you work, in fact, everything is kind of off kilter and at different angles to each other. And that's because they're built on the terrain and they have to fit into and negotiate with the terrain to sort of find the flattest areas where they can sort of start building a foundation. So what I do is I built this hill and I sort of and I started building the level on the hill. And if you notice, that's why you just end up getting so much more interesting verticality, and you guys start getting more interesting shapes and architectural details. And I'll run through a bunch of these now, but like I think that is my number one tip, is when you start a level, just throw down some geometry. You can absolutely edit the heck out of your geometry and make it the space that you want it to be, but building on a flat surface is poison for level design, and building on an uneven surface is like a really, really interesting like architectural constraint. So for example here, this space is built into a hill. I live in like a valley, and like a lot of houses are this kind of split level design where I might go into, where was I? Over here. I go into this little classroom over here, and I go in on the ground floor, and there's some stairs that lead down, so I imagine this is probably a basement. But because it's built into a hill, this is actually a ground floor from the other side of the house, if that makes sense. And it's just like really interesting to sort of add in these architectural quirks that aren't in a lot of games, because I feel like they're built the geometry first and then the landscape around them, which is not how Mother Nature flies, is it? She makes us bend to her will. So here is another example. This is like, I feel like this is the ground floor, but actually like all of the different areas of this lighthouse have actually been built at slightly different levels because they're built on a hill. So I go up these steps here and up a couple more steps to this sort of area here. And when you look out from this window, you get like a much nicer like vantage point over this room because it's at a completely different height. So height differentiation and things like that. It also makes levels more readable. Like as I come out here, I'm at a different level to that building, which makes it feel like I can see more of I can see and understand the geometry much better. Yeah, so that is my favorite point that I always advocate, which is never build on flat geometry, never build on flat terrain, always build some kind of arduous terrain for you to build on. And that is, we're coming to the end. We're at the lighthouse now, so I'm just going to make my way up the lighthouse. And so this is an interesting thing that I came across in the Last of Us is how do you make the end of a level feel impactful when you don't have the traditional cliche fallback of a big boss battle, right? So like I made some of the last levels of the Last of Us, and I did the giraffe level and then all the way to the finish, basically. And I had this problem where I wanted to make it feel like the end of a level, but The Last of Us is not the kind of game to have a boss battle in it, so or a big bombastic boss battle anyway. So how was I going to make it feel really like the end of a level? And a really simple technique is just to make the journey, the path to the final room, quite long, because then you feel like this must be leading up to something. This must be. It builds tension. It builds tension as to what you're going to find at the end of the tunnel. So, and it makes it feel more impactful just by virtue of space. If I'm going to spend all of this time and geometry on this path, then it must be worth something. So I did that right up. I don't know if anyone's played The Last of Us, but the final room the operating room where you find Ellie, we tried to make that whole way leading up to that space as long as possible. And I think I could have done a better job of that as well, but the technique still stands, even if the execution doesn't. So here we climb up all the way to the top of the lighthouse. Again, we get like this nice little victory lap, little vista of the space. And I think this will work. I use the telescope. I thought I'd end on a telescope pointing at another destination so that people could be like, oh, cool. So the final thing that the player has to do is imagine what they would do to get from the lighthouse to the castle. And that sort of, you can see I've got exactly the same setup here. I've got a starting point, an ending point, and a bunch of random geometry in between for me to play with to get to the end of the space. So that brings us to the end of my level design and environment art techniques talk. They're not clapping for me, but I appreciate it, thank you. I hope that was okay. If there's anyone that has any questions, just hit me up on Twitter. I'm Peter__Field, just to complicate it. Yeah, thank you very much for having me, SideQuest. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. The end.